Over the years, the Command & Conquer franchise has continually reinvented itself, particularly in regard to the art direction. Each installment has a distinctive and recognisable look, and Tiberian Sun is no exception to this. There is a strong contrast between the increasingly futuristic technology and the barren, lifeless wastelands that make up the game's setting. Perhaps the most recognisable aspect of the art style is in the colour palette, where muted, desaturated browns and greys contrast heavily with the bright and vibrant blues, greens and oranges of the Tiberian scarred landscape. With such effort being put into the artistic direction of the game, it's perhaps not surprising that during development, the intention was for the environment to have a greater impact on gameplay than would ultimately be the case when the game launched. Of the many design elements that combine to create the overall look of Tiberian Sun, arguably the most important is the game's lighting system. In Tiberian Sun, the crystals fluoresce a sinister green light, and nod bases pulse with a red energy. Urban environments are illuminated with a clean white light, whereas in the wilderness, the light comes from the mutated Tiberian flora and fauna. There was a time though where the purpose of this lighting was to do more than just look good, and would actually have a direct impact on the effectiveness of your units. We're going to look at this particular piece of the game's development history today, along with some residual art assets that we can re-enable. We can see some of these lighting elements in play in the very first mission of the game. On the southern edge of the screen there's a Tiberian field glowing its distinctive green. Now this lighting doesn't work exactly the way that a lot of people think it does. It's not the crystals that are actually glowing, but rather a static lighting effect applied to the map. All light sources in Tiberian Sun are actually generated by invisible light posts, each set to produce a different colour of light. Besides the glow of the green Tiberian, we can also see in the GDI base that there is a bluish white light illuminating the area where the dropships land, most easily recognisable by contrasting the look of the pavement and sand on the eastern side to the far western side. As mentioned, it's not the Tiberian itself that produces this glow, and this is most readily apparent if you look at the Tiberian in the second GDI mission around where we begin the level. You'll notice that the Tiberian fits a lot less naturally with the world around it, and it's these missions in particular where the age of the game is more readily apparent, contrasting with the levels that make more extensive use of the lighting effects. But besides the ambient lighting, there are also examples of more directed light in the game. At the entrance to the GDI base in that same first level, we see a pair of light towers illuminating a small patch of ground outside the main gate. When an enemy soldier strays into these areas, it will be targeted by that spotlight, illuminating it for any other soldiers nearby. In the final release of the game, this was nothing but a piece of visual flair, but in the development phase, this actually served a practical purpose for gameplay, and tied into the cut, night fighting aspect of Tiberian Sun. If you go into the game's skirmish mode and decide to generate a new map, one of the options you have to choose from is a time of day setting, where you can pick from morning, afternoon, dusk, and night. In the final release, the difference between these four settings is a relatively minor aesthetic one, but during development, the effectiveness of your units would have decreased as overall ambient light levels decreased. Units fighting at night would have had a harder time hitting their targets, but not all units were affected equally. Certain vehicles would have produced a lot of light, or were simply large enough in their dimensions that the to-hit modifier would not have been that greatly affected. Conversely, infantry would have had an easier time of taking shelter in the dark. Shooting a prone infantry hiding in the foliage would have been a lot harder at night than would have been during the day. But the light conditions would never have been totally out with the player's control. In fact, there were a couple of options you could employ to increase light levels, particularly in your own base. Furthermore, it's entirely possible that certain vehicles would have been outfitted with equipment that would have made them have an easier time identifying targets at night. There are a couple of holdovers from this point in the game's development history, and we can re-enable a pair of buildings that would have been available to the player to help them have an easier time identifying targets. These buildings are complete with their own cameo for the sidebar and build animations. So we've come back to rules.ini in order to make a few minor tweaks in order to re-enable this content. Before I do so though, I'll quickly point out, somebody informed me that the only reason I have access to rules.ini by default is because I'm using the CNC.net version of the game. If you have an older install, you'll maybe need to use something like XCC Mixer in order to extract rules.ini, in much the same way you did art.ini in a previous video. Anyway, the first thing I want to search for is G8 light here, and I want to go down to where this is defined, not this one, but the next one here. You can see this particular file was intended for ownership by GDI and Nod, but at some point was taken out of the tech tree. So what I'm going to do here is remove the negative to re-enable it here. Change from 12, I don't know who left that comment, must have been at some point during development. What I will add is a prerequisite just before we begin here. Like so, and then I want to do GA power here, so that's a power plant for GDI. So if GDI wants to use this, what they will need to do first is build a power plant. That makes sense to me. And you have your kind of the color of the light defined down below here, and various other things like this here. Let's say it draws 5 power in order to use it. Okay, so our second thing we want to search for is GA spotlight. Like so. I'm going in the wrong direction. It's further down. Here we go. Here's our spotlight then. So this is the light tower that we saw outside the entrance base. Let's make that Tech 1 as well. I don't think we need to make any other changes here. We'll add in a prerequisite as we did before. If I can type. And then GA power again. I need to define an owner though. That is one other thing. It doesn't matter what order you put in the lines here. So I'm just randomly throwing this one in, owner GTI. Okay, we are done here. We've made those changes. One thing you will want to do though, in much the same way that you have 2 gates at your disposal, one for each orientation, the spotlight is going to be in a fixed direction. Now, unless you want to have multiple entries for light towers in the right hand sidebar during the game, the best option is probably to change the sweep of the light that you're going to have when you place the light tower. So you can do so by searching for spotlight, and near the beginning of this file you're going to have some spotlight controls, so let's talk our way through them here. So the speed is pretty self-explanatory. The movement radius here is how far from the center of the sweep it kind of splays out as the sweep travels across the ground. So example would be during the middle of its sweep, the spotlight is held closer to the building proper, but as it extends outwards, the sweep of the spotlight goes off, doesn't just move in a constant arc around it, but rather moves almost linearly along the ground from left to right. What I want to do here is actually comment this out. So I'm going to have this set to 0 now instead of its default value of 2000. So this is going to make it so it travels constant fixed distance from the light tower. I don't want to have just this small arc here though. Hang on, we've skipped over a few things. The location is how far from the building proper that light is going to appear on the ground. Acceleration is pretty self-explanatory, ties into speed. The last one though, all this is defined in radians here. So I want to sweep around the tower of, let's say, 2 times. So I need to convert to radians here. 720 degrees is approximately 12.5 radians. I will make an extra comment here actually before I do anything else, just so I don't forget the default values. There we go. That's generally how I make mods in or modifications in this file. 12.5 radians then, so the spotlight now, if I have a light tower in the center of the screen, the spotlight will complete 2 full sweeps and then turn back and go the other direction. If you want to have it go just a constant direction the whole time, there's nothing to stop you from adding just a bunch of zeros to the end here. Now you may run into like a too higher number for the game to handle. I've never had this happen when I've had it set to this in the past. I've had games going for hours and it's never had issues with light towers spinning in place for the entire duration of the match. I, however, just prefer, just to avoid any potential errors, having a more manageable number for the game to handle. Anyway, and that's us done in rules.ini, so let's go back to the game and see how this has affected things. Okay, here we are in the game then, and we're going to have a look at our new structures here. All I need is the power plant to enable access to our 2 new buildings, or old buildings. I can also demonstrate here, the Tiberian here, the light doesn't quite extend as far as it does in the southern field, so that's kind of what I was talking about. On the right hand side here, you can see our light post. And as I mentioned, it has its own cameo by default, and as I place this down, you're going to see this area of ground is more brightly illuminated than it was before. And we're also going to build a light tower here, which I forgot to set a price for, but I don't suppose it matters at this point. And there we go, you can see it's got a full build animation as well as it comes spiraling out of the ground. And we have our spotlight. It's going to pass in a loop a couple times around. You can adjust the speed of it as you want in the rules.ini file. And there we go. 2 full sweeps I would expect from that thing. Now unfortunately there's no way for us to re-implement the gameplay affecting qualities of these 2 structures. What I've done in the past for these things is had maybe like a sensor array effect on a tower here, or perhaps a Vulcan machine gun placed in the tower. It has different defensive qualities compared to a component tower, so it's stronger or weaker against different weaponry. It is its own kind of unique thing, and it just has a cool visual look to it. I want to make one final comment on the light post sprite here. To me, my eyes, I've always seen this as kind of like a Victorian era lantern type building, and I think it's because it's so small you don't recognize it for what it is. It's actually a series of floodlights like you might see at a football game, and there's actually an image released from the game's beta phase that shows a much larger light post tower, and it's more recognizable for what it is in that setting. I think that would have been a much better look for it in the game. There's no settings where this smaller light post is a better fit, so yeah, it's a shame that we don't see that graphic in the game itself. Now, these are far from the only art assets that exist in the game files that you can re-enable. There are actually a number of other buildings, but I thought since these relate to a specific area of the game's development that I would put them in a separate video and talk about the lighting mechanics that were once, or at one time, going to be included in the game. In the previous video I talked about some early Tiberian Dawn and Red Alert era vehicles that you can re-enable from the game files, but there are actually a couple of buildings as well that during the game's development served a unique role, but ultimately were cut before the game's release. Now, these art assets actually still exist in the game files, so next time I'm going to be having a look at a pair of removed buildings, so I hope you'll join me again for that. Thanks very much for watching, guys, and I hope you've been enjoying this series on cut content in the Command & Conquer games. I've got a couple more ideas for videos coming up, so if you're interested, please stick around. Besides that, I have many more, some 400 videos on the Command & Conquer franchise up on my channel now, so if you're just looking for some Command & Conquer gameplay, then feel free to check some of those out. I've got them all organised into playlists for the various games I've played. And indeed, I'm looking at playing Red Alert 2 in the near future, which will be my very first time going through that game. Thanks again for watching, and join me again soon for another video.